If you are a man over 60 and someone new has just entered your life, there is something happening right now that you cannot see. It is not dramatic. It will not announce itself with a slammed door or a raised voice. It moves quietly, through small gestures that feel like kindness, through routines that feel like comfort, through a closeness that feels on the surface like exactly what you have been missing. And that is precisely why you keep missing it. The very things that make this connection feel good are the things that make the pattern invisible. You are not looking for danger in a warm dinner, a familiar voice on the phone, a hand resting on your shoulder. Nobody is. But there is a pattern, one that shows up again and again in the lives of men your age, a pattern that can quietly cost them their freedom, their savings, even their health, and it almost never looks dangerous at the start. By the end of this video, you will be able to see it, not guess at it, see it clearly, the way it actually shows up in ordinary conversations and ordinary routines, including the one part almost nobody warns you about until it is already too late. It rarely starts with an argument. It starts with a small adjustment he barely notices himself making, a dinner time that shifts by half an hour because someone else prefers to eat later, a weekly call with an old friend that gets pushed back again, then quietly stops happening at all. None of it looks like loss. Each individual change is small enough to dismiss. That is exactly what makes it work. Psychologists who study long-term relationships describe behavioral accommodation, the gradual process by which one person's habits reshape around another's preferences, almost always without either person noticing. It is not manipulation in most cases. It is simply what closeness does to a schedule. But here is what most men do not realize. After 60, your routines are not just habits, they are infrastructure. The walk you take every morning is doing something for your blood pressure. The weekly card game with the guys is doing something for your mood that no amount of companionship can fully replace. The specific way you have arranged your evenings, your meals, your sleep, you built that, slowly, over years, often after a divorce or the loss of a spouse, often through real trial and error. Of course, not every adjustment is a problem. Two people sharing a life will always shift around each other a little. That is normal and even healthy. The issue is not change itself. The issue is when the change only ever moves in one direction. You might be thinking, but isn't compromise just part of being close to someone? Sometimes yes, but there is a difference between compromise, where both routines bend toward each other, and erosion, where only one routine survives. The way to tell them apart is simple. Ask yourself how many of your weekly habits, the ones that existed before this person arrived, are still standing 6 months later. If the honest answer is fewer than you expected, that is not an accident. That is the first sign. Picture it concretely. A man who has played golf every Saturday for 11 years finds himself rescheduling, then skipping, then quietly replaced by his old foursome without ever deciding to quit. He never said he was giving it up. He just stopped showing up, one Saturday at a time. That is how it actually happens. Not one dramatic decision, but 100 small ones that never feel worth fighting for on their own. Here is the common mistake. Most men assume they will pick the old routine back up later, once things settle down. They rarely do. The new pattern becomes the default, and the old one becomes something you mention less and less, until you realize you have not mentioned it in months. But routine is only the surface. Underneath it, something more expensive is usually shifting too. Of course, not every new partner has an agenda, but money moves differently after 60 than it did at 30, and most men never adjust for that difference. At 30, a financial mistake usually has time to correct itself. There are working years ahead, raises coming, decades to rebuild. After 60, the math changes completely. There is no more, "I'll make it back next year." What is in the account now is largely what there will be for the rest of life, and that single fact is exactly why men in this age group have become a specific, identifiable target for a particular kind of financial drift. Researchers who study elder financial vulnerability point to something called incremental commitment. the tendency for small, individually reasonable requests to accumulate into something much larger than either person originally intended. It rarely begins with a request for money at all. It begins with something smaller, something that barely registers as a transaction. Picture it specifically. Dinner is on him this time because she forgot her wallet. Then it becomes most dinners because it is simply easier. Then there is a car repair she cannot quite cover this month, and he offers before she even has to ask, because that is the kind of man he is. None of these moments feel like a pattern from inside them. Each one feels like generosity, like care, like exactly the kind of man he has always wanted to be for someone. That is precisely the mechanism. The behavior that puts him at risk is the same behavior that makes him a good partner in every other context. This is not a flaw in his character, it is a feature of it, being used in a direction he never intended. Of course, this does not mean every gift or covered bill signals exploitation. Generosity exists in healthy relationships too, and two people building a life together will naturally blend resources over time. The distinction is not whether money moves between two people. It is whether that movement runs in both directions, openly or only ever in one direction, quietly. You might be thinking, surely he would notice if it became serious, but that is exactly what incremental commitment is built to prevent. Each individual step is too small to trigger alarm. It is only when you add 6 months of small steps together that the total becomes visible, and by then, the relationship itself has often become the reason he does not want to look too closely. Here is the common mistake. Most men track this the same way they track everything else in a relationship, by feeling, not by numbers. They ask themselves, does this feel okay? Instead of asking, what does this actually add up to? Feeling is not a reliable measurement here because the entire dynamic is built to feel okay at every individual step. There is a simple way to correct for this, and it has nothing to do with suspicion. It is the same thing a careful man would do with any major financial decision. Write it down. Not because he expects the worst, but because numbers do not drift the way memory does. A man who reviews 3 months of spending side by side will see a pattern that feeling alone could never have shown him, one way or the other. Sometimes that review brings relief. Sometimes it brings clarity he needed. Either outcome is better than not knowing. Money is one thing he can track, if he chooses to look closely enough. What happens to his body is something he often only notices after the damage is already done. There is a moment many men over 60 describe the same way, the day they realized they were taking care of someone else and no one had asked if they were ready. It does not arrive with a conversation. It arrives with a Tuesday. A doctor's appointment that needs a ride. A bad knee that makes the stairs difficult. A flu that turns into 2 weeks of soup and errands and rearranged plans. Each request is small and entirely reasonable on its own, and refusing any single one of them would make him feel like a poor partner. So he says yes, every time, because saying yes is who he is. Gerontologists who study late-life relationships describe this as role drift, the gradual, often unspoken shift from partnership into caregiving, one that neither person explicitly chooses and that often goes unnamed for years. It is not anyone's fault in the moment it happens. That is exactly what makes it so easy to miss. Here is the detail most explanations skip over completely. Caregiving is not just time-consuming, it is physiologically expensive. Studies on caregiver health consistently show elevated stress hormones, disrupted sleep, and measurable increases in cardiovascular strain among people, especially older adults, who take on sustained caregiving roles, even when the caregiving is given willingly and out of love. The body does not distinguish between caregiving you chose and caregiving you drifted into. It responds to the load either way. Of course, caring for a partner is not inherently a problem. Real partnerships involve real support, especially as both people age, and a man who refuses to ever show up for someone he loves is not protecting himself. He is simply avoiding intimacy. The issue is not caregiving itself. The issue is asymmetry, when the caregiving only ever flows one direction, and his own health quietly becomes the thing nobody is managing. You might be thinking, isn't this just what loving someone looks like at this age? Sometimes, yes, but there is a difference between two people supporting each other through the normal difficulties of aging and one person slowly becoming the unpaid infrastructure that keeps the other person functioning. The first feels mutual even when it is hard. The second feels, quietly, like a job he never applied for. Here is the common mistake. Most men do not notice the shift because they are measuring the relationship by whether they still love this person, not by whether the relationship still has room for his own needs. Those are two completely different questions, and only one of them protects his health. Think back to a time you canceled something for your own well-being, a checkup, an exercise class, a quiet afternoon you had planned for yourself, because something more urgent for someone else came up instead. One instance like that means very little. Everyone reschedules sometimes. But when you look back over a year and the pattern only ever runs in one direction, that is worth noticing, calmly and honestly, without guilt attached to the noticing itself. The identity question goes deeper than caregiving, though. It touches something he has spent decades building. Ask any man who has been divorced or widowed twice what he misses most about being alone, and the answer is rarely silence. It is himself. Remember what I told you at the start? That there was a pattern most men not only miss, but actively mistake for something good. We are getting close to the center of it now. By the time most men reach their 60s, they have built something quiet but valuable. A set of friendships that took decades to earn. A handful of hobbies that are genuinely his, not shared, not explained to anyone, just his. A rhythm to his days that reflects exactly who he is when no one is managing him. This is not selfishness. This is identity, built slowly, the only way identity is ever actually built. What happens next rarely looks like loss from the inside. The friend group narrows, not because of conflict, but because evenings that used to be spent with the guys are now spent as a couple, and somehow it always feels rude to suggest otherwise. The hobby gets quietly reframed as something to be shared, or something there is simply less time for. None of it is forced. All of it is volunteered, one reasonable sounding adjustment at a time. Psychologists describe this as identity foreclosure in late life relationships, the gradual narrowing of a person's independent sense of self as it becomes increasingly absorbed into a shared identity defined by someone else's preferences. It is most common, researchers note, in people who are lonely before the relationship begins, because loneliness makes merging feel like relief rather than loss. Here is the detail that matters most. This does not feel bad while it is happening. It feels close. It feels like finally being known. That is exactly why it is so easy to miss, and exactly why it is the most dangerous version of this pattern, not because it is cruel, but because it is comfortable. Of course, sharing your life with someone necessarily means some version of yourself will change. That is not the warning here. The warning is when the only version of you that remains is the version this specific relationship allows. You might be thinking, but isn't that just what real love does? Change you? Real love does change you, but it does not require you to disappear in order to be loved. There is a difference, and the difference shows up in one simple question. If this relationship ended tomorrow, would you recognize the man left standing? Or would you have to rebuild him from the friends and hobbies you let go of along the way? This is not a question men enjoy asking themselves, and that is precisely why most never do. It is far more comfortable to assume that closeness and self-erasure cannot possibly be the same thing, because the relationship feels good in the moment. But comfort is not the same as health, and a man can be genuinely happy inside a dynamic that is slowly costing him the very things that made him interesting to be close to in the first place. Here is the common mistake. Most men wait for a clear signal before they reconsider anything. A fight, a betrayal, a moment of obvious harm. But identity foreclosure rarely produces a clear signal. It produces a slow, comfortable quiet, and quiet is exactly what makes it so easy to mistake for peace. All four of these reasons are visible if you know where to look. The fifth one is not, and it is the one that makes the other four possible. Here is the part almost no one says out loud. It is not that he falls for the wrong person. It is that loneliness lowers his standards for what safe looks like. This is the answer to the question that has been sitting underneath this entire video. Not which signals to watch for, but why a smart, experienced, perfectly capable man ends up missing all of them at once. Researchers who study late-life loneliness describe something direct and uncomfortable. When a person has spent an extended period genuinely alone, after a divorce, after the death of a spouse, after children move away and the house goes quiet, the brain's threshold for what counts as safety quietly drops. Attention itself recalibrates. Behavior that would have triggered caution at 50 can feel at 65 simply like relief. This is not weakness. It is biology responding to an environment that has changed. The brain is built to seek connection, and after long enough without it, almost any attention starts to register as belonging. Here is the specific detail that explains everything in the four reasons before this one. The man who slowly loses his routine, his money, his health, and his identity is very rarely an unintelligent man or a naive one. He is very often simply a lonely one, and loneliness is not a character flaw. It is a state that, left unexamined, makes a person less able to evaluate the very relationship that is supposed to be solving it. Of course, this does not mean every relationship formed out of loneliness is a problem, or that loneliness automatically leads somewhere harmful. Plenty of genuinely good relationships begin exactly this way, with two people finding each other after a long, quiet stretch. The issue is not the loneliness itself. The issue is making decisions from inside it without ever stepping back to look at them from outside it. You might be thinking, so what is the actual fix here? It is simpler than it sounds, and it has nothing to do with becoming suspicious of every new person who enters his life. It is simply this: before treating any single behavior as proof of safety, ask whether you would still feel the same way about it if you were not lonely when you noticed it. That single question, asked honestly, undoes most of what loneliness quietly does to judgment. There is something empowering in this, even though it might not feel that way at first. None of the 5 reasons in this video describe a fixed trap that cannot be avoided. They describe a pattern that loses almost all of its power the moment it is named. A man who knows that loneliness lowers his guard can choose to slow down in exactly the moments his guard is lowest. A man who knows routine erodes quietly can choose to protect it deliberately. None of this requires distrust. It requires awareness, which is a very different thing. That is the quiet truth underneath everything covered here. It was never really about whether to let someone new into his life. It was about doing it with his eyes open, instead of letting comfort do the deciding for him. Once you see this pattern, you cannot unsee it, and that is exactly the point. So here is everything this video has actually been about, brought together in one place. Routine, money, caregiving, identity, and the loneliness underneath all 4 of them. These are not 5 separate warnings. They are one single pattern, viewed from 5 different angles, each one making the others harder to see on its own. The bigger truth underneath all of it is simple. The qualities that make you a good partner, generosity, loyalty, a willingness to show up for someone, are the exact same qualities that, left unexamined, leave you most exposed. That is not a flaw in you. It is the price of being the kind of man worth being close to in the first place. You do not need to overanalyze every dinner, every favor, every quiet evening together. That is not what this is asking of you. It is simply asking you to notice, occasionally and honestly, which direction things have been moving. So here is what I want to know from you. Which of these 5 reasons hit closest to home for you or someone you know? Comment the number below. I read every comment, and on this channel we look at exactly this kind of thing every week. The patterns most people never get told about until it is too late. Next time, we look at the one sentence a new partner says in the first month that tells you everything about how the relationship will end.